Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores human behavior through a behavioral science lens. I'm Kurt.
And I'm Tim. We like to explore why we do what we do with researchers, authors, and practitioners in a conversational setting in order to share their insights with you.
Before we get into our conversation for this episode, we just want to thank you for checking out Behavioral Grooves. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, or at least leave us a quick rating or a review. It doesn't take long, and it will help you get one of your New Year's resolutions over before the end of January. That is, if you actually had the New Year's resolution of reviewing us or subscribing to us or just giving us a quick review. Anyway, because we like helping people achieve their goals, you can just go ahead and stop this right now and do it.
I think that's fantastic. And speaking of reviews, we got a really nice review this week from Vicky, who wanted to share her thoughts on our recent episode with Jonah Berger. She said, quote, "Absolutely engaging. You guys have managed to deliver tons of insights in a cheerful note. Congrats." Thank you, Vicky. Thank you. And Kurt, I just have to ask, did you get that little musical pun there with, cheerful note?
Cheerful note?
Cheerful
note. I got it, Tim.
Tie-in, right?
Yeah.
Did you get that?
I get it. Yes, we bring music into this thing because you wanted to bring music into this, and
it
I
worked.
do, and it worked, and I appreciate it. Actually, I've become a convert. I give you grief, but I am a convert. Really, really there. All right. More importantly, thank you, Vicky, and thank you to all of you who take a moment to rate the podcast or give us a quick review. These reviews go a long, long way in helping Behavioral Grooves get discovered by people searching for new podcasts, and we really appreciate your effort there.
Yeah. Okay. So just to reiterate the importance of these very, very simple gestures like writing a review or giving us a quick rating, it's like paying it forward for the next listener. Your review or rating moves us up in the recommendation algorithms and actually helps people discover what you've already come to know is a really great resource for applied behavioral science.
All right. So, Tim, let's get on with our conversation. Who are we featuring in this episode?
Oh, we are featuring the totally fabulous Nuala Walsh, Kurt. Nuala is a founding member and non-executive director of GAABS, the world's first association for practitioners of behavioral science. She is the vice chair for the UN Women's Subcommittee for Risk and Governance, where they promote human rights to neutralize gender inequality through advocacy and awareness. And Nuala is also the founder of MindEquity, a behavioral science consultancy helping companies with reputation management, culture and conduct change, and communications and decision-making.
And that's after 20 plus years in the corporate world with companies like Standard Life and BlackRock. She's another classic underachiever, right, Tim?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think we actually need to get some actual underachievers on the show because all of these people are achieving so much. Just make me feel, inadequate. I don't know.
Totally.
All right. Enough of my troubles here. So we talked to Nuala about some research she's done recently into two areas of corporate life that we thought were particularly important. The first is about how we remember fake news, just as if it were real news. And the second is about whistleblowing in the corporate world. She even offers some great tips on how to build a culture that gives employees a strong sense of psychological safety so that they can report on bad behaviors without worrying about retaliation.
So with that, we encourage you to sit back and relax with a draft of Guinness, a crust of brown bread, and a shot of whistleblower preparedness, and enjoy our conversation with Nuala Walsh. Nuala Walsh, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thanks, Tim. It's great to be here.
It is a pleasure to have you here, and we're going to get started with a speed round. Kurt, did you want to get started?
Sure. All right. We're going to start off with our old-time favorite. Do you prefer coffee or tea?
Tea for breakfast, coffee for afternoon.
Oh, that's backwards than some of our other guests who have done exactly the opposite of that.
Irish, I would have expected all day.
Well, coffee all day and wine in the evening. So I don't want to break your binary question.
Maybe we're going to have to start asking that question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wine and not Guinness, huh? All right, there we go.
Regular bread or brown bread?
Brown bread with the tea for breakfast every day.
Every day. Nice. All right. All right. So dinner with your favorite behavioral scientist, sports star, or musician?
I'm going to go for, it's not a behavioral scientist, no offense.
Mm-hmm.
I was hoping you were going to ask me about actor, actually, but I'll go for musician.
Musician. All right. So if you were going to have an actor, who would that have been?
Well, I would have picked, if it was an actor, I'd have gone for Anthony Hopkins or Robert De Niro.
Yeah. All right. And Tim will want to know which musician you would like to pick, because that's Tim's groove.
Tim, that's such an obvious question with such an obvious answer. The answer has to be the songwriter for Another Orion, of course. Oh. That would be Tim.
Oh, okay. This just got really embarrassing all of a sudden. All right, let's keep moving with the last question in the speed round. What's the likelihood of fake news getting ingrained in your memory as real news?
Very high.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. Tell us how you come to know that.
It's a great question, and it's a real problem. The answer is quite simply down to the mere exposure effect. There are so many repeated news stories that the more you hear, I mean, scientists have shown that, repeated exposure to stories, whether it's on news feeds or reading, increases not just, I guess, the story's credibility, but also its plausibility. And it just creates a new false memory in the same way. And they've proven, this has been proven several times. And even when people are warned against it, even when people are told there's a danger of fake news, it contributes to, I guess, what they call memory stickiness of fake fragments. So the more you hear it, the more you believe it's true. So, and even when the facts are disproved, which is, of course, the illusory truth effect, it doesn't make a difference. It's perceived reality. And, we're just basically really poor, not only that, but then we're really poor at detecting deception. So I did find a study that was a meta-study that actually said that there were 206 different studies that concluded that we spot deception only 4% of the time. Now, obviously, the corollary of that is that 96% of the time we are highly gullible.
Oh my gosh, that seems amazing. And we tend to think that we are better at detecting lies than we are too. Isn't there some aspect of truth there?
Yes, well, we do. Well, I mean, you can look at the above average effect, which basically means that we think we're better at detecting lies in the same way we think we're better dancers, communicators, drivers, and everything else. So if you add in the overconfidence effect, if you add in any egotistical bias, you'll find that is not really a surprise, Kurt. We can't help it.
Which then lends itself into this fake news being even more insidious in kind of getting into the vernacular that we have in our memories and just the general discourse that we have, because we would know I can detect the fake news, and yet so this obviously isn't, and then it just gets transmitted even that much more quickly, right?
Exactly, and I think Dan Gilbert has written about it as well, and he says that we find it very easy to believe, and it's much harder to doubt. I suppose if you think about it, the fact that it's easy, we always look for the easy answer. We answer the easy question, not the hard question, right. And the lack of critical thinking. I mean, it's effort. It's system 2. We don't want to go down that route. So it's actually simpler to just take the news that you're given. So it's a real problem, and I'm afraid it's not getting any easier. And I think I did read something that wasn't there a study that showed 70% of people, it was an MIT study, 70% of people were more likely to retweet falsehoods than the truth. And of course, they'll travel 6 times faster than anything else. So it's a compounding error.
It's absolutely incredible. Annie Duke recently sent out a newsletter where she pointed out that President Trump recently claimed in a tweet, he said that no president has ever won both Ohio and Florida and lost the election. He won both Ohio and Florida, but he actually, of course, he did lose the election. And in fact, that claim wasn't true. Apparently, Richard Nixon had this very same experience in 1960. And I thought it was interesting because what Annie pointed out was lots and lots of, sarcastic, anti-Trumpers getting in there and saying, well, that's just baloney. But none of them actually challenged the underlying fact. They didn't actually do the research to understand that the claim itself wasn't true. And I think it's really interesting that if we don't challenge these false claims, people are people just going to remember things, constantly that even though they're not true?
Well, I think they are. And you bring up a good point about Trump. I think on one of your previous podcasts, I'm not sure who it was, but somebody found that wasn't there, Trump was responsible for 38% of misinformation or disinformation. And that, of course, all goes back to the messenger effect. So the power of who's giving the message, I think, is one thing. So it's not just that, but as you say, it's also then about the people who are recipients. The more you trust the messenger, the more people trust, whether it's Trump or anyone else. I mean, people can give out misinformation unintentionally because it's such a cumulative effect. It becomes a false memory. A parent can do it. So people can very innocently doing this. It doesn't always have to have malicious intent. So people can innocently do it. And that's the problem with a compounding error like this, that we hear things and because it's just repeated, we believe it's true, and therefore it just becomes ingrained. And Kahneman talks about the experiencing self and the remembering self. It's the misremembering self. It's not even the remembering self. And because we are all prone to misremembering, the problem gets even worse. So I guess my argument is that false memories are as dangerous as fake news, because it's a similar process. They look very different, and of course there are a number of differences between them. But what they have in common is the fact that they're both flawed associative mechanisms. They both spread information in this networked ecosystem of data. Neither of them have warning flags, so they're very hard to detect and control. But both of them are fundamentally rooted in, I guess, inaccurate premises, which become layered and layered into our belief system over time. And that makes all of us vulnerable to error, delusion, and potentially regret. And of course, in conditions of either uncertainty or distraction, or we're just busy, we become cognitively overloaded and distracted. And going back to the first point, we don't have the time to think about it and check these facts and this information, or even to probe our own memories. And nobody wants to think. We all prize our memories, and they're very special to everybody, and we want to keep them intact. So even the idea that they may be false and they may be erroneous isn't something that people readily want to engage in. But I think it was Elizabeth Loftus. She did one study, but herself and Pickrell, it might have been, basically did some experiments where they tried to implant deliberately false information. And they tried a couple of different things which are really interesting. One was the false idea that someone had got lost in a shopping mall, that someone had spilled punch at a family wedding, or that someone child got lost in the car and released the handbrake and it rolled into something. And these experiments then kind of got progressively worse, if you like, or more serious. And they kind of planted these messages around where somebody punched somebody, or somebody was punched, or someone was attacked by an animal, or committed a crime. So there's a whole variety of false memories being deliberately implanted rather than automatically implanted, which is what we do. And the findings were very clear that basically people really, really struggled to see the difference between what was real and what was false. And if you add in this fake news phenomenon now, I think it makes that whole area really, really difficult. And if you're in business, and you're doing it in a business environment, it creates a whole cascade of unintended consequences for businesses, customers, and shareholders.
All right. Well, there's a lot, I think, within that, and that I want to come back to and unpack, particularly around some of the mismemory, false memories, but also this, the impact that has on business. But before we do that, so we talked about the, Trump and his component, and I believe it was around 30, about a third of the misinformation around coronavirus was attributed to Trump because of, as you mentioned, the messenger effect. And I think what is really interesting about that is that Trump has done a really good job, and others around him, of making the other sources of information within his followers to be very skeptical. So in other words, that the idea that there is fake news, the fake news comes from some other people. And so you're actually limiting people's kind of desire or even willingness to go out and to address looking to see if the information is real, and really just saying, I am the only person you can trust. And I think that has to go, and whichever side of the political spectrum you're on, I think both sides are probably doing it to a certain degree. Obviously, it's pretty apparent when you're looking at our current president right now. How does that play into some of this element? I mean, we talked about the difficulty it is that we are naturally inclined to just believe. It was the quote that Tim brought up from Annie Duke, and some of the stuff that you said about how it's easier. But if it's really actually going out and saying, hey, not only is it easier just to believe me, but the other side is going to be telling you lies anyway, even if they're not. How does that play in from your perspective?
I think you have to look at Trump. And again, I take your point. It's irrelevant what side of the spectrum you're on. He's actually done a marvelous job of creating doubt and creating this binary view. And the fact that it's whether it's him or his acolytes or people around him, it creates tremendous doubt in people's mind as to what is real and what isn't. And it's a very clever tactic, I think, to get other people to give the bad news for you or to say these things. It almost takes away from him, so it's not just him that's doing it. It's this other group around it. And in fairness, I think that happens in companies all the time as well, at a different scale and to a different degree. And it doesn't have quite the consequences of a president doing it. But I think it's very consistent with all that we've been talking about. But I think it makes it even more dangerous because it's so polemic. And it has such serious consequences for people who just readily accept it, rather than, to Tim's point, or to Annie's point, which is, actually query it. But it's not surprising, because people, whoever you admire, whoever you hold up, is subject to the halo effect. And we see it all the time. Whoever you admire, they're rarely questioned. And I don't think it's not an obedience to authority point, which is quite different. I think it's the halo effect, and the fact that when people are held in such high esteem, which he is by his followers, they just choose not to. And the word is gospel, and we've seen that in many jurisdictions. You've seen it with Jim Jones and his followers. So you have it with people who I think automatically have power. And who have that role. You might even have it with experts. I mean, we all listen to experts, and we don't query experts. So you don't query the doctor, you don't query the lawyer, and we all know that the doctors, lawyers, and so-called experts, and they're expert relative to us, but we know that they make mistakes and that they're inconsistent, and that's been proven time and time again in behavioural science. So I think people have that tendency to just accept at face value the word of experts. Without actually questioning. And in this instance, to his followers, Trump, I think, is, an expert.
Well, and to a large degree, we learn about things in the world through other people telling us. I learned that the world was round from my mother. I didn't go out and measure it. I didn't go out and prove that, or do any research to make sure that my mother was was correct when she just told me, I trusted her. And I think that it kind of gets into, Steve Martin and Joe Mark's fantastic book about the messenger is the message. And that is terrific. But I want to get back to the corporate. You brought up the implications in the corporate world. Tell us more about your thinking along those lines, Nuala.
Yeah, well, I guess given that I have spent 3 decades in corporate life, I see a couple of issues here, and the messenger effect is actually quite relevant. The power and ego is quite relevant here as well. But even just employees. So I think there's a difference between the people who are giving the message and the people who are getting the message. So let's just say you're in a company and you're receiving the message, and the messages are usually generated, top down, reinforced by internal comms, HR, etc. So cultural messages are really powerful, and they're just repeated. So the more that anything is repeated in a company, it becomes ingrained. And whether it's true, so whether it's true or not, so this the mere exposure effect to constant messaging in companies, whether it's about results, whether it's about somebody's career ambition, really is important. But if you're at the top and you believe messages so we all know the difficulty that the higher you climb in a corporate ladder, you don't really have truth tellers around you. People are too self-interested, and the CEO has a very lonely role. So, if the CEO is exposed to people who are deliberately or from fear not telling them the truth about, certain issues that might be happening in a company, and there are plenty of examples of those, they are in a very, very vulnerable position. So if they are repeatedly told a falsehood, if you like, or just from fear that people are afraid to tell them what's really happening, you have a very, very dangerous situation where CEOs of FTSE 50 companies or Fortune 500 companies are making decisions based on false premises. And that can matter whether it's about shareholders, whether it's about mergers and acquisitions, whether it's about the value of companies, new product timing, safety issues. It doesn't matter what the issue is, but we've seen that time and time again, and that problem of CEOs and people at the top not challenging enough or inviting enough dissent, critical thinking, query, devil's advocate, all the usual things that you would expect, I think is terribly dangerous and prevents learning and reinforces a cycle of error, decision error and judgment error throughout companies.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I hear what you're saying, particularly around that cocoon that gets around senior leadership, right? And the yes people that are there to just reinforce the messages that that leader wants to hear. So how do you go about what are some, you mentioned devil's advocate, you mentioned, queries and doing different things, but what are some of the ways that if I am a corporate leader, how can I get out of that cocoon? How can I move past that in order to make sure that I'm actually hearing what's really going on out there?
It's a great question, Kurt. And the problem is that people in the cocoon, they're very smart. They're not stupid people. So they're very smart people. They know this. So they know they should get different opinions from people. And sometimes they do. But again, if you look at the studies and if you look at the findings, and even if you base it on your own experience, people don't move. People don't move from their opinions. People are intransigent. It's confirmation bias over and over again. So it's only the really smart ones, and sometimes it might even be the insecure ones, who do go out and, deliberately plant a devil's advocate, having an ally. People are now developing advisory boards. So people at the C-suite are consciously trying to do this because they know that there's groupthink, they know that there's the cocoon, and people are either afraid or unwilling for self-interested reasons, to share what's going on. People at the top have to consciously get independent people, whether it's consultants, whether it's advisors. I think it really is the only fair way, correct way that they can try and mitigate against their own bias, because ultimately it is their own bias. Ultimately they listen to themselves too much, and you get into this cycle of, and it is an illusion of invulnerability, people think nothing will happen to them, and they suffer. They think they're always right. They listen to their own ideas and intuitions. You've got belief bias, you've got the endowment effect. Their ideas are always the best ones. And if you've made something, you've got the IKEA effect. Yeah. And people just don't hear the truth about their own incompetence enough. So I think a couple of those options would certainly help. But, the person has to commit. It's probably like the alcoholic. Yeah. You have to commit, and you have to want to change, and you have to want to do that. Otherwise, it's just lip service, and other people are wasting their time.
Which is the good thing about Tim and me. Tim tells me how much of an idiot I am all the time, so I don't have that cocoon around me.
It's only about half as many times as you.
Well, all right. If we're being fair here, it's an interesting piece. Just about what you were saying too about the cultural messaging that happens, and are those cultural messages that are being repeated, are they the ones, are they actually factful, and then two, where did they come from? I remember when I first joined actually the company where Tim and I met, there was this kind of this story that was going around that the owner, the founder, who had years ago when there was a recession and a person had lost their job and was about ready to lose their house, gave them a $10,000 check. I have no idea if that is true. Have absolutely there was no fact checking it, but it played into the culture of this organization, that it was a family, that it was this. And so even if it wasn't true, it really impacted at least myself in how I thought about what type of organization this is and what it means. And so, I'm wondering, it's not necessarily always a bad thing. It just isn't always the truthful thing, I guess, is there. So
But it is powerful, Kurt, and you're absolutely right. And some of it's really positive. And at the end of the day, employees want to buy into the story. So employees want to think their leaders are terrific and the company is going to protect them if anything goes wrong, and that they're surrounded by friends. And that is absolutely natural and human instinct. We want to think that. We want to believe the narratives that we're told. Like, we all have a positive self-narrative. You go to work, you want to believe that you're going to be fairly paid, that you're going to climb the ladder, be appropriately remunerated and promoted based on merit. I mean, that's what people subscribe to. That's part of the psychological contract that people have when they join a company or a particular culture. And I think you raise a great point. It is culture specific, and the better companies really harness these stories. And that's the role of internal comms to some extent, but then it's also bottom up and top down. So it is this marrying of what people really believe. I mean, I think a small example is I think with the George Floyd case recently, I think wasn't 1,600 people in Google petitioned against having police contracts renewed. I mean, it's the voice of 1,600 people in a very positive culture. So they positively, collectively felt that they could make a stand, have a voice, and say something. And that's born from a particular culture, a culture of psychological safety and open expression, which is deliberately cultivated by that particular organization. Whereas you might have another organization on the other side where people don't feel that they can speak up, and they do their own surreptitious surveys. I think it happened in Nike, actually. I think there were a group of females who felt that HR were ignoring their concerns. So they did their own internal survey, and then of course it leaked, and there was quite a lot of noise made about that, but it was reputationally damaging for Nike. So the cultural stories determine whether the individuals have a voice and what kind of voice they have, and ultimately, how cohesive it is. But the norms, the cultural norms, are absolutely critical, and it's what we all buy into, and it's why people stay in the companies that they stay in. I've been very lucky in my career. I've had some fantastic, cultures, and it's one thing you miss. But it's not. Is it the culture or is it the people? It's the people. It's the people within that culture, and I think that's what makes a difference and why people stay with organizations.
Yeah, and I think that brings us back to how these normal people can fall under the sway of these different people, but it gets back into some of this work that you've talked about from false memories and this idea that our memories are malleable, and that we might have held a belief maybe when we were younger, more idealistic, and that now when we look back on that, if we've fallen underneath the sway of this, we tend to remember that differently. We maybe didn't hold those ideals as strong, or we remember that we didn't hold those ideals as strong, or we held other ideals that were much stronger than they actually were. How does that all play into? I think there's probably some connection between the two. I don't know if you can talk to that, but that would be fascinating, I think.
Holding our ideals. I think of one individual when you spoke about that, Ted Bundy, for example. If you look at Ted Bundy and the life of Ted Bundy, right to the very end, Ted Bundy controlled his audience. I mean, he did what he did. He denied it to the end. But he controlled his audience and badly wanted to control what people thought. And there's a book by Anne Rule, who was his friend. She was a former police officer. She did a hotline, a suicide hotline with him in the evening, and she considers herself a friend. And she cannot get over how she missed all of the signs that he was what he was. And there's a quote where he talks about how he talks about himself in the alter ego. And I wish I had the quote now, but I don't have it because it's too long. He used to say a lot of things about himself, but he wrote about himself in the alter ego, and he had made no apology right to the very end. So even whatever memories he had, he justified it right to the end in terms of what he did. But he described himself in really glowing terms. But his identity, but my own conclusion on reading this was his identity as a serial killer, he was quite happy with. He basically said, I'm quite happy with who I am. After all that had been done, there was no apology forthcoming. But my point was around the identity. He was very comfortable with it. So whatever views he had as a child, however it evolved, at the end and in his last kind of, he spoke to a lot of writers at the very end and told the story he wanted to tell, not the story he wanted to tell. And he told in this alter ego voice, which a lot of it was him, but again, plastered with him sanctifying himself, of course, in the stories. But it is very interesting. And as you say, that might shed some light on, how we evolve and how we develop. So whatever memories you have, they evolved, but I think it links quite closely to identity.
That is a little bit mind-blowing when I think about our current president too, and some of the things that are going on there. But I don't want to go down that road right now. I was wondering if we could switch over and talk a little bit about some of your work on whistleblowers, because again, getting back to the corporate world, the bystander effect is something that's been studied for some time. But you've been doing some digging in this, Nuala. Tell us about what your observations are right now.
I did. I have been fascinated by the bystander effect for a very long time. And the bystander research has evolved in waves, if you like. I mean, it did start in the 70s, the Latane and Darley work around, the murder of Kitty Genovese in New York, where nobody intervened, basically. And so many years, it still exists. So I suppose what was really curious to me was, in my career, watching people, and we've all done it. So it's not that we sit sanctimoniously and say we've never done it. We have all been bystanders, and we probably will all continue to be bystanders in certain circumstances. But the question is, when it matters, are we still bystanders? And what I wanted to try to get to was, how can you get organizations to encourage people not to stand by, to speak up in a secure, external manner when it's a high consequence situation. Obviously, small stuff can be dealt with, on the spot. So what I really wanted to do was explore, was there a way where companies can use certain type of messaging or anything else to try and influence it. So you've had, you know Cialdini, you know him well, you know all the fantastic work that he's done around social influence and norm-based interventions. So there's been a rake of work done there. And there's also been a lot of work done in organisation whistleblowing, in the 80s. So only in the last 5 years, not even 5, actually 3, have such things started called dynamic norms. So dynamic norms are basically the social norm which are extrapolated to and it will continue in the future. So it focuses on the bandwagon effect and the movement that people think that something's trending and it will continue. Therefore, I need to keep doing this too. So, Sunstein describes this as one of the most important or exciting areas in behavioral science this decade. The dynamic norms. So, of course, this had to be the basis of my research. So I basically did an RCT with nearly 1,000 employees. And I was really, my 2 questions were simply, does exposure to, certain dynamic norms amplify the employee's decision to whistleblow or to bystand? And does this differ by type of person, male, female, different personality types? And what I also wanted to test was emotion. So I was really interested to see what this triggered. So I had a huge database, far too many factors, of course, I tested, but I couldn't resist, so I did it anyway. But the long and short of it is that what I basically found was that people, when it comes to something as emotive, as difficult, as involved as whistleblowing, that people are initially incredibly intentional. In my case, 91% said, oh yes, that they would whistleblow. They were exposed to, it was a hypothetical bullying scenario using a vignette, and they said that they would whistleblow. But when they came to be tested at the end of the experiment, 9% took some action. Now, we know that, but what I found, incredibly interesting there was the power of emotion. So, in terms of, everybody said they were going to do it, but when it came to it, actually very few did it. So there were an awful lot of, I guess, surprises, if you like. I was surprised that despite the outrage, and think outrage in terms of the reaction to Trump, the outrage and the depth of emotion, people didn't act, despite the perception and awareness of it being a trend. So the social norm did not work in this case. And this was the first experiment that had been done in whistleblowing using a social norm. It was the first experiment that had been done in an organization context, again, using this norm. So it was the first in many respects, but the outcome basically didn't hold up. So that then asks the question, if it didn't hold up, what can we do? So what I found was that, very interestingly, was that people or companies tend to rely on the wrong tools, the wrong types of people, and sometimes even the wrong triggers to get people to speak up. So from tools, I'm talking about your code of conduct, your rules-based programs, the thou shalt not rules that companies have all the time, but they're just so ineffective. And there's chapter and verse written about that. But when it came to people is an interesting one, because Kirshen, when we were talking about the cocoon earlier on, at high levels, we all know that typically the majority of leadership positions are male, and they are extroverts. Now, I didn't know this at the time, but actually extroverts has been found by a Harvard study. Most leaders are extroverts. Take that as you will, but that's the study finding. So when companies are trying to encourage people to speak up, those CEOs typically look to their leaders to tell them what's happening, and there isn't enough of a focus on people through the ranks. So using the power of positive messaging, people didn't respond to, for example, responsibility. So companies love to say that responsibility, let's tell people, it's your responsibility, you must speak up and you must report any infraction, etc. But when it came to promoting just that, people didn't speak up. What got 4 times the response was actually anger. So a company that keeps messaging about responsibility isn't going to get people, because people are kind of responsible in their tasks during the day. they didn't feel as strongly about it when it came to speaking up against illegal or immoral conduct. So there is something there that I think is certainly worth looking at.
Yeah, there is this huge say-do gap, right? The intention and behavior gap is monstrous. To think about this, 90% say that they will, but only 9% actually act on it. And when just to continue this discussion about what can we do about it? What can companies do? So, in addition to plumbing emotions, you also talked about people. What are the ways that an organization can use their people and their internal messaging to encourage more, or to decrease the bystander effect and to encourage more whistleblowing?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that they can do. So I would say beyond the safe speaking up culture, which is quite strong. I mean, that they're easy words, but that's very, very difficult to do it. So, for example, in terms of framing, there's a reframing. There's a whole reframing around this. So the word whistleblowing is negative. The word reframing, the word speaking up is positive. So there's a whole shift in how companies can rewrite how they message to employees. So activating the positivity, even appealing to rational self-interest. So candidates who come from tainted companies, i.e., let's just say companies where there is low speaking up because they're scandalized, for example, earn 4%, and the scandalized companies earn 4% less. So by definition, you will earn 4% more. It will have a knock-on effect if you go to another company, if you leave. So positively turning these messages into empathy, into rational self-interest is one thing. So there's a whole, I speak to a lot of companies now about how to reframe their messaging. So there's another thing about rewarding employees. So again, it's all the behavioral science tools that can be used here. You reward the employees with relevant incentives. And I don't mean financial. I mean, positively recognizing people, salient stories of courage, talking about people in the company, people outside the company who can do this. So you can reference, the Jeff Wiggins, you can reference the Harry Markopoulos, you can point to what happens when this doesn't work, but you can also point to people internally. And this is a delicate one. You can't just point to somebody internally. You can appropriately highlight teams where errors have prevented disasters in companies. So of course you can't pinpoint an individual because you've got personal risk and all of the rest there. But if it becomes team based, and one of my findings was also that people prefer to report in teams, as in report wrongdoing in teams. So if companies encourage that and make it less secretive, because the problem now is that whistleblowing or speaking up is secretive, so it's not a social norm. People don't know that it's happening. And because what's secretive develops its own narrative in itself. So there are a number of different ways that companies can now look at how to, and I've developed a reframe model, which actually, it'll take us a lot longer than today to go through it. But in principle, there are so many different actions, and you wouldn't do all of them, but you would do some, because it depends on the company size, maturity, and what activities they have in place already as well. So you have to just start with what people have and with where they want to go and where their people are psychologically. So there is a framework where a number of different areas. I think that can be dialed up here, but there is no shortage of things that companies can do here if the spirit is willing, and if from the top down they have a genuine interest in not just getting people to speak up, but in listening up. So it has to be two sides. It is two sides of the same coin, because you cannot get people to speak up into a dangerous environment. And unfortunately, many people have, and unfortunately, many people have paid the price. So this has to be done. And the more you make it open, the more you make it communal, the more you make it part of the cultural norm, the less fear that is induced. And people, typically haven't done this out of fear of consequences.
Yeah. Well, Nuala, you've talked a lot about how you bring in behavioral science into organizations and using this behavioral science. And you have been one of the founders of a new behavioral science organization, GAABS, right? The Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists. So help us, just give us a little bit of an overview of what this is and what was led to its development.
Well, it is a superb new initiative, I think, for the industry. What it is basically a member-based organisation for practitioners. It is a governing body, might be a little extreme, but it is a body that accredits individuals or organisations who meet a set criteria. And the genesis of it is really quite simple. The idea is that we're trying to avoid people who are unqualified, if you like, going out to companies claiming to be behavioural science who don't meet the brief, because the implications for companies and for the field is really dangerous. This is an unregulated field that's growing in popularity. The word behavioural scientist, according to Bloomberg, it's going to be the #1 job of 2021, if you believe Bloomberg. And doesn't it suit us all to believe Bloomberg? So
is that fake news? There we go.
Well, I don't know, but I'm choosing to believe it because it's in my interest to believe such a thing. And I'm sure many other are too. It used to be the data scientist, but now it's behavioural scientist. So because of that, and because of the interest, and because of the need for behavioural science, this body really is just there to make sure that we provide a quality seal for behavioural scientists who offer a quality filter, if you like, for the companies using them. So it's a form of stewardship, it's a form of governance, and it's really good for the members, because they can say, I am part of GAABS, I've been approved by GAABS, and the criteria are pretty, they're not overly stringent, but they're stringent enough. You can't just have red nudge, to qualify. So, and that's what's happening.
What about nudge and predictably irrational?
Well, now then you're in. Now you're in.
No, it's fantastic. It is fantastic that you guys are doing this, and you've got a tremendous board of advisors. You got Danny Kahneman and you got Bob Cialdini, and it's very, very impressive. And I really, we wish you guys good luck. We wish all of you good luck to expand this, because if in fact behavioral science does become the #1 job, well, wouldn't that be cool? We would all benefit from that. That would be terrific. We only have a few minutes left, and I have to get to talk to you about music. When you were building up this blah, blah, blah about, singer-songwriter Tim Houlihan, whoever he is, I thought you were going for Van Morrison. And I was like, oh my gosh, that was a big departure for me. But so I'm sorry to prime the witness on this, but do you have a COVID playlist, and who's on your COVID playlist?
I do. I shouldn't tell you my Van Morrison story because it's embarrassing, but I will in my 1 minute of my 3 minutes. When I was very, very young, I was in a record shop, and the person I was with really liked Van Morrison. Van Morrison walked into the record shop with some people, and the person said, oh God, I'd really love his autograph. So I went running up Grafton Street, because I decided I was going to be the hero in this case. So I went running up the street and said, excuse me, Mr. Morrison, can I have your autograph? And he looked at me with a filthy look and he said, sure, and pointed to his friend beside him. So Van Morrison is not on my hit list, and I don't think I'm on his either. But if I did have a playlist, seeing as how you did ask, I'm an 80s person, so I probably would have the Eurythmics, Tina Turner, Queen. It's quite eclectic as well. I would probably have some of the Michael Jackson songs. The Earth song is done by an opera singer called Carmen Monarca, which is amazing. So I do have that on my list. I have Sia, Chandelier by Sia. I have a little bit of U2. So Van Morrison, no, but U2. Every Irish person has to have U2 there. Yeah. And one of my favourite songs of all time is probably, and believe it or not, Mr. Presley himself. So I've been to Graceland. I went on that Delta Pass for $200 when I was like 18, 30 cities in 30 days. But I got there, and, I would certainly have a little bit of the King in there as well.
Fantastic.
That's a really eclectic mix. I love that. So one of the things that we're always curious about is, do you like to listen to music when you work?
No, absolutely not. No.
Silence?
Silence. I listen to music when I run. That's about it.
Yeah, Tim needs silence too when he works. He can't do that work with music going on. Is it does he distract you, or is it just something that you just don't find pleasing, or what?
Well, I'll tell you, it's a good question. When I have a drink, actually, I get inspired. If I want to write, and if I'm kind of stuck for ideas, music will inspire me to write. Is that work? I don't consider that work. So when I'm working, if I was doing work for a client, no. But if I was trying to write or think creatively, a glass of wine and music, and I would normally come up with some pretty eclectic ideas.
So, given your earlier answer, that's in the evening then that you're doing your writing. Is that how that works?
We're hoping.
I would only prejudice myself if I answered that question. I'm taking the fifth.
You're pleading the fifth. Oh, fantastic. Nuala, thank you. This has been really intriguing, and I think some of the wonderful insights, and I'm sure that our listeners will get a lot out of this. So thank you very much.
Thank you to you both.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our discussion with Nuala, have a free-flowing conversation, and talk about whatever else comes into our false facts as true remembering brains.
False facts as true.
Yeah.
Man, that's us human beings, isn't it?
It really is, and it actually goes to explain a whole bunch of what is going on, I think, in the world right now. And it's really not just a corporate issue, it's a worldwide issue. And it's just part of our natural way that we misremember so much of what we do.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And given things that have been happening in the United States at the state capitol, there's a lot of activity and a lot of behavior that's based on false facts. But we won't go into that. How about if we start our conversation on Nuala about the mere exposure effect, because she brought this up and actually combined it with the above average effect and overconfidence effect as being the key contributors to our misremembering.
Yeah, well, you think about the mere exposure effect, right? This idea that the more you see something, the more that you tend to find that you like that, or you believe that is true. So this echo chamber of a world that we have, where we hear the same information, even if it's false, over and over and over and over again, just by the fact that it gets exposed so often to us, we are more likely to believe it, which is really sad when we think about that, but that's kind of how it works. And so we have to be able to discern, are we believing this just because it seems familiar, because we've heard it so many times and that it's easier for our brain to process, which is what the mere exposure effect says, or is this actually true?
Yeah, and you combine that with the above average effect, or what sometimes gets referred to as the Lake Wobegon effect, where
in Minnesota, at least it is. Yeah,
at least in Minnesota, this idea that we really, each of us really believe that we're above average, but of course that's statistically impossible. Half of us have to be below average. Only half of us can be above average. And then the overconfidence, which just says, I really do believe that I am better and that I can do things that superhumans can do. When we combine all that together, those things conspire to make our memories feel like they're real when in fact they're not. And this is a real problem. And I think that this bleeds over into the corporate life as well. Leaders can be subject to this, especially where they think, well, I remember doing this, and I'm taking credit for that because it happened on my watch or whatever. And that builds up over time and leads to basically remembering fake news.
Well, and you're the overconfidence effect, right? And the above average effect, like Wobegon piece. How many times, and maybe this is more of a rhetorical question here, right? But how many times have you been in a conversation with somebody that you share this experience, and then when you remember it very differently, and both of you fully believe that you remember it the right way, right? It's like, there's no way I'm misremembering this. This is how it happened. And it happens all the time with my kids. It happens all the time with my wife. And And to that degree, we all believe that. I mean, to our hearts, in our heart of hearts, we believe our memory is right. And yet we know at least at some point, one of those two differing viewpoints has to be incorrect. And actually, probably more likely is that both of them are somehow incorrect in different ways. Right.
So we are classic misrememberers, but the trouble is we rarely do we have the objective truth standing out there to actually demonstrate to us that we're misremembering.
Yeah, we don't have a videotape of our lives that we can rewind and go, oh, sorry, let's take a look at this. Oh, play it. Oh, yeah, that's right. I didn't say that. You said that. Okay. I'm sorry. I misremembered. Yeah, that's not how life works. And even sometimes when you have those or those tapes, like you look back and you go, "Oh, that must be fake," because I remember it differently. Somebody made a deep fake of me.
Exactly. Well, this you and I were talking about this a little earlier. This is a good recollection of James Dease's early work, right, on the way that we misremember or that we misassociate things.
Yeah, and McDermott and Roediger did some really interesting work in the 90s on this, really looking at false memories, right? And the idea, some of the cool research they did was doing these memory lists. Basically, you'd put together a list of words, cold, winter, snow, different
shovel,
pieces, shovel, various different pieces. And then you let people have some time off, and then you have them come back and say, what are the words on there? And oftentimes on that list, people will put blizzard, even though blizzard wasn't even on that, because it had that whole component of saying, hey, here are these things. And so people will misremember because it aligns with that idea of the group, right? That this is part of this group. And I think the syntax of it. And what's really interesting about that is you tie that aspect back in with confirmation bias and the anticipation of what an event is going to be, the likelihood of misremembering things and believing those fake facts, right, is much higher because you have this element that says, hey, my confirmation bias is already leading me to see things in a certain way. And now I'm putting it into this group of this belief system that I have, and I'm going to fill in these blank spots with the ideas that I believe should be fit into there, as opposed to what is reality and what actually happened. So,
absolutely. There are also implications then for leaders inside the cocoon. Basically, if they are only living in this echo chamber, people who are reporting to those leaders are probably not going to object. They're just going, when the leader says, well, this is the way I remember it, most people are just going to go, yeah, well, okay, that's not the way I remember it in my head, but I'm going to agree with the leader because he or she is leading the group, leading the business, and I'm just going to go along with it. And it's really important for leaders to get outside of that echo chamber, to be able to have some kind of outside counsel, I think, in order to work against this cocoon-like experience that many have.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And again, it only works if that outside counsel is somebody that the leader is going to trust and to be able to stand up. Because as you mentioned, right, it's that echo chamber that people have. It's the yes men or people, right, that are surrounding those leaders. And you don't have the dissenting voices. You don't have those, well, that's not how I remember it. And then having a conversation about it that may actually go back and say, oh, yeah, you're right. I forgot about that. You're right. It was that instead of this. Right. And it's interesting because Tim Rogers of the University of Wisconsin-Madison talks about memories, and he says, look, what we know is that memory studies show us that our memory is always a blend of what we know about the world generally, plus what we retain from a recent experience. And it's adaptive because we're usually using what our memory is to cope with new situations. And so we use these, and leaders use these memories to cope and to figure out what's going on in the current situation. And they're adaptive. We know that we recreate those memories. We know that they are not this video recording of what we're actually doing, but they are this recreation every time we remember them. And to a certain degree, it goes back to that confirmation bias. It's like, all right, if this is the current situation and I have a belief about what we need to do, my memory is more likely to confirm that belief than it is to disconfirm that belief. That is a really scary piece when we think about that.
Let's talk about whistleblowers and bystanders, right? This is the second major part of what Nuala talked about with us. And it really got me thinking, especially when she started working through the tips, how important it is for us to practice, how important it is for us to have some training in how to deal with being a whistleblower and not just being a bystander, because that's not something that we do, right? That's not something that we have to deal with on a regular basis. And without practice, it's going to be really hard for employees to A, know what to do, and B, make sure that they feel comfortable within the culture, that it's an okay thing to do.
Right. And to that point, the culture part is really important here, right? It's making sure that you have a culture that is accepting of a whistleblower. And those are subtle things, right? Those are those unsaid looks and different pieces when you are presenting a dissenting view, pushing back on some other things, not even like a full whistleblower type piece, but what is the culture that you are engendering within the organization that lends itself to a person saying, yep, I think this is great, and I feel really safe in being able to bring this concern I have to life, to leadership or outside, without feeling that I'm going to be, put in danger or potentially lose my job or be reprimanded for that. And I loved her research, right? That research is 99% said that they would whistleblow, but then when they actually got into actually doing it, it was only 9%. It gets back to that practice part that you talked about.
Absolutely. Maybe we could just quickly run through those tips because I think they're so fantastic. And maybe we start with the last one because you said culture really matters. And her last tip was to make it normal. Mm-hmm. Like this whole idea of let's build a culture where it's okay. In fact, it's not just okay, it's normal to identify somebody who's doing something bad. And that's not just acceptable, but supported.
Yeah, because you cannot get people to speak up in a dangerous environment, right? And that is just this really big piece of this. So make sure that that culture is open, that you make it more communal, that you really push this team element, that you're saying, yes, this is really key for the team. To be able to look at this and not have the diffusion of responsibility that often, well, somebody else will make the whistleblower, that no, this is my responsibility as part of that culture. So I think that's really cool. What else do we have there, Tim?
I think that the second big tip that I really loved was reframing. Nuala said that whistleblowing is a negative word. So let's reframe this, right? Let's actually get a more positive spin so that companies can shift how we look at the idea of being someone who is a good corporate citizen, not just a whistleblower.
Yeah, and I think another key piece of this is leaders have to think. We think that whistleblowing or calling attention to these bad things that a company is doing has a bad economic effect on the company. But in reality, what she's saying is, look, scandalized companies have a much bigger impact. And so if you can catch it, if you can have this open culture where people are bringing these up so it doesn't become a big scandal, that is really a positive thing for the company, the stakeholders, everybody that you really want. So I think that's good.
And she also talked about rewards and recognition, which she talked about them separately, but we oftentimes bring them together because I think that they do fit nicely together. And this is the whole idea of taking away the secrecy, like make sure that teams feel comfortable with the training that they need to prevent disasters, right? To actually act in a more proactive way. And the way that you do this is by recognizing people who are doing the right stuff and by rewarding them in non-monetary ways, right? You don't want to be paying people bonuses for being whistleblowers necessarily, but not necessarily.
I don't know. I mean, there could be times where that might actually be a good thing to do if your culture is such that it's really negative. I don't know. I mean, I think it's obviously contextually dependent upon the culture, dependent upon the industry. But there are those times where it may actually be something where, hey, there's an economic impact for me highlighting the facts of where we might get in trouble and the people that are doing bad things. So there are some aspects of that I would say, hey, let's take a look at that. Don't just disregard that out of hand. All right. With that, folks, thank you for listening. Note, we talked a little bit about GAABS, and note that Nuala is going to be on another episode with us coming up in the next few months, where we're actually going to go take a deep dive into GAABS. So stay tuned for that, because that'll be a fantastic episode, and where she's going to have another guest. At this point, TBD, but it's going to be awesome, and that's going to be great. And with that, stay tuned for a bonus track with Tim.
Nothing can stop me from trying. Tonight is just another Ryan.
Hey Groovers, this is Tim with your bonus track and groove idea for the week. In our conversation with Nuala, we focused on two critical issues that face our world today. The first is how our memory has a difficult time differentiating between recollections of factual news and fake news. Our political and business leaders need to keep this in mind as they communicate with the citizenry and their employees, because misinformation can spread just as easily as truisms. We simply have too many biases that will contribute to us misremembering the facts if we're barraged by repeated fake information. Our second point of conversation with Nuala was about whistleblowing, and she reviewed several key ways that leaders can take steps to make their corporate cultures more conducive to calling out bad behaviors when employees see them. The list is worth a review, and they're in the show notes. For your groove idea for the week, we'd like you to think about what Nuala said regarding her study on whistleblowing. She said 90 to 99% of employees indicated they'd call out bad behavior, but only 9% actually did it. We know that it takes practice to do just about anything that is unfamiliar. So if you're a leader in an organization, walk your team through an exercise to role play identifying and calling out bad behavior. What would that bad behavior look like? What words would the employees use to describe the bad behavior? And who would they tell, and how would they tell them? By giving your employees the opportunity to walk through an imaginary scenario by using real words and asking them to make real decisions about who they'd tell and what they'd say, all of those things arm your employees for the undesirable day when they actually experience bad behavior in their job. You can make a difference, and we urge you to give it a try. Well, with that, Groovers, it's time to wrap up another episode of Behavioral Grooves, and we hope that this week you take what you learned from Nuala and go out and find your groove.